Ex-husband pushed the ex-wife at the arbitration table until a dormant clause awakened under her signature. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main characters. Maria sat across from John at the arbitration table, a mixture of tension and determination in her posture. She had been through this before, but today felt different. The air was thick with unspoken words, a history of pain and resentment simmering just beneath the surface. John, her ex-husband, was no stranger to these proceedings. His presence was calm, almost too calm, as if he were in control of everything. He always had to be in control. Their divorce had been finalized years ago, but the past had a way of creeping back into their lives, especially when money, assets, and legal matters were involved. The room was sterile, quiet except for the soft scratching of pens against paper as both their lawyers reviewed the documents. But Maria wasn't paying attention to the paperwork in front of her. Her mind was racing, and her eyes kept flicking to the signature line at the bottom of the page. She had signed plenty of papers in the past, each one marking the end of another chapter and a tangled relationship. But today was different. Something felt off, like a subtle shift in the atmosphere that she couldn't quite pinpoint. John, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table, his gaze never leaving the papers. He was waiting for her to make the first move, just like he always did. He was the one who always pushed for everything, always the one to demand more, to control the outcome. As they sat there, Maria couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about the money. It never had been. It was about power. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this time, she could take control back. The sound of a page turning snapped her. Back to the present. John leaned in, his voice low but firm. Maria, he said, his eyes meeting hers with a cold intensity. You know this is the only way. Sign it. She hesitated. Her hand hovered over the signature line. But then, just as she was about to write her name, something caught her attention. The clause. The dormant clause she had forgotten about. It had been buried deep in the fine print of their original agreement, something neither of them had ever paid much attention to. Until now. Maria's eyes widened as she realized the implications. This clause could change everything. With one simple stroke of her pen, she could awaken something she never thought she'd need to use. Her heart raced. Was this the moment? Was this her chance to take control? She looked at John, his smug expression still in place, unaware of what was unfolding before him. With a deep breath, Maria signed the paper, but this time, it wasn't just a signature. It was a declaration. A shift in power. The dormant clause was now active, and everything was about to change. Maria's hand remained frozen over the signature line as she absorbed the weight of what had just happened. The dormant clause, now awakened by her simple action, seemed to hold a power she hadn't fully understood until this moment. John's confident posture remained unchanged, his eyes still locked on the papers in front of him, unaware of the monumental shift that had just occurred. Maria could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the silence in the room thick and suffocating. She knew that signing this paper would change everything, but it wasn't just the document itself that had power. It was the clause, buried deep within their original agreement, that now had the potential to turn the tables in her favor. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the rush of adrenaline made it difficult to focus. She had never intended to use this clause, not even when she first signed the papers years ago. It had seemed irrelevant then, a distant possibility, a detail buried in the fine print. But now, it had become a game-changer. The weight of it was clear. The clause allowed her to reclaim certain rights that she had lost when the divorce was finalized. She wasn't sure what exactly it would mean yet. But she knew she had the upper hand now. As she put the pen to paper, her hand was steady, the decision made. Maria had regained control, and there was no turning back. John looked up, still holding that confident smirk, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. He hadn't noticed the claws before, and he hadn't anticipated Maria making such a move. But now, there was no denying it, she had taken back a piece of what was hers. He cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, but the confident air he had carried with him into the room was slowly slipping away. Maria could see it, and a small, quiet sense of satisfaction spread through her. She had spent years feeling powerless in their relationship, always bending to his will, always compromising for his benefit. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt as if she was the one with control. The room was still, the only sound the soft rustling of papers as the lawyers began to take notice of the shift. One of them glanced up, sensing the change, but neither Maria nor John spoke. The lawyers, who had been nothing more than silent observers up until this point, now seemed to be waiting for something, some indication of what would happen next. Maria's mind raced as she tried to calculate the implications of her actions. The dormant clause could be her ticket to regaining what she had lost in the past. She had worked so hard to build her life after the divorce, but there had always been a lingering feeling of being trapped by her past decisions. Now, it felt like she had unlocked a door she thought was forever closed. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time, she had hope. John, still silent, seemed to be running through the same calculations in his head. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips pressed into a tight line. He hadn't expected this. The power dynamic had shifted, and he was no longer the one in control. Maria could see the realization dawn on him. He might try to fight it, but she had already made her move. The game had changed, and she wasn't about to back down now. The silence in the room stretched on, but Maria could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. It was as if everything had stopped, time itself holding its breath. John sat across from her, his expression now carefully neutral, but she could see the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He was no longer in control. The game had changed, and it was clear he didn't know how to respond to this shift. The lawyers, who had been mere spectators up until now, began to shift in their seats, exchanging quiet glances. They knew something had just happened, something important. Maria's mind was still racing, trying to piece together the implications of what she had done. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt empowered. The dormant clause had been a safety net, something she hadn't planned on using. But now that it was activated, she knew it gave her leverage in ways she hadn't imagined. The clause gave her more control over the assets, more say in the decisions that would affect her future. John had underestimated her. He had always seen her as the one who would back down, the one who would comply with his demands. But today, she had taken a stand. She could feel the change in the room, the shift in the atmosphere. John's composure, the calm facade he had maintained for so long, was starting to crack. He shifted in his seat again, this time with a more noticeable unease. "Maria," he said finally, his voice low and controlled, though it lacked the confidence it had held earlier. "What do you think you're doing?" Maria met his gaze with a steady calmness. "I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago," she replied, her voice even but firm. She had no intention of backing down. John's lips tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. His mind was working quickly, trying to understand how he had missed the clause, how he had let this moment slip through his fingers. He had thought this would be a straightforward settlement, a quick resolution to their lingering financial disputes. But now, Maria had the upper hand, and he was scrambling to regain his footing. "You're making a mistake," John said, his tone more urgent now, though he tried to mask it with bravado. Maria didn't respond immediately. She could feel the power of the moment, the shift in the dynamic between them. For once, she wasn't the one on the defensive. She wasn't the one trying to appease him, or make concessions. She had taken control, and now it was his turn to react. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as the tension grew. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the principle, the power that each of them held in this moment. Maria was no longer afraid of John's tactics. She knew what he was capable of, had seen it all before, but today was different. Today, she wasn't the one who would be manipulated. John's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his fingers tapping the table rhythmically. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a warning. Maria didn't flinch. She had no illusions about what this meant. This wasn't over, but she had taken the first step. And that was all she needed. She didn't need to win it all in one go. She just needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Maria could feel the weight of her decision settle deeper within her as the moments passed. John was still seated across from her, his posture rigid, though his eyes had now narrowed in frustration. It was clear he was still trying to calculate his next move, trying to work through the implications of what had just happened. He had underestimated her, and he knew it. Maria, however, was calm, collected, her mind moving with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting to John's moves. She was making her own choices, taking control of a situation that had once felt completely out of her hands. John's attempt to maintain his composure was faltering. His usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. "You think this changes anything?" he asked, his voice tight, almost as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. Maria didn't flinch. "It changes everything," she replied simply. She hadn't just signed a piece of paper. She had unlocked the door to something she had long been denied, and she wasn't about to let go of that newfound power. John's lips pressed together into a thin line as he looked down at the table. He was silent for a moment, processing the shift in power. The room was still, save for the soft rustling of paper as the lawyers shifted in their seats, sensing the tension that had escalated. Maria could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't care. This wasn't about them. It was about her and John, and the balance of control that had been tipped in her favor. "I don't know what you're thinking," John said after a long pause, his voice tinged with both disbelief and frustration. "But you're making a mistake if you think this will be the end of it." Maria met his gaze again, steady and unwavering. She knew this wouldn't be over today. She had no illusions about the road ahead. This was just the beginning of a much longer process, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "It doesn't matter what you think," she replied coolly. "What matters is that I have a say in this now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. John opened his mouth as if to say something more, but then closed it, his frustration mounting. He knew better than to argue further in front of the lawyers. Maria watched him, a sense of calm settling over her, as she realized how far she had come. The woman who had once been afraid to stand up for herself, the woman who had spent years making compromises, was no longer there. She had stepped into a new version of herself, one who was ready to take control and shape her own destiny. John's silence spoke volumes, but Maria wasn't interested in what he had to say anymore. She had made her move, and she wasn't backing down. The balance had shifted, and though the path ahead was uncertain, Maria felt a new sense of power and clarity that she hadn't known before. It wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about taking control of her own life, on her terms. As the minutes passed, the room seemed to close in around them, the tension palpable. The lawyers were waiting for the next step, but Maria had already made hers. It was now John's turn to figure out how to respond to this new reality. For the first time, Maria felt like she could breathe, the weight of years of passivity finally lifting from her shoulders. The game was no longer just his. It was hers now. The quiet that followed, the tension in the room seemed to heighten. Maria could hear the faint sound of her own heartbeat, but the stillness was soon interrupted by the soft shuffle of papers and a cough from one of the lawyers, trying to ease the growing discomfort. John sat back in his chair, his hands now resting on the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically as though trying to regain his composure. Maria had never seen him like this before. Usually, he was the one in control, the one who dictated the terms. But now, the tables had turned. She could feel it, that subtle shift in the balance of power. For so long, she had allowed him to have the upper hand, to make decisions for both of them. But today, that had changed. Today, she had taken back what was rightfully hers. John cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. "You're not going to get away with this," he said, his tone more subdued, but still sharp. "You've just given yourself a temporary advantage, Maria. That's all." Maria didn't respond immediately. She could feel the weight of his words, but she also knew the truth. They were just words, nothing more. He was trying to regain his footing, trying to salvage what was left of his confidence. But Maria wasn't about to be swayed. She had spent too long bending to his will, too long making concessions. She wasn't going to let him push her around anymore. "This is not a temporary advantage, John," she said finally, her voice steady, firm. "This is me taking control of my own life." The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was different. It was as if everyone, even the lawyers, understood the shift that had just occurred. John, for all his bravado, was now on the defensive. Maria could see it in the way his shoulders slumped slightly, the tension that had once been present in his posture now replaced with uncertainty. "You think you've won, don't you?" John said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "I'm not the one who's won, John," Maria replied, her gaze unwavering. "I'm simply standing up for myself. And that's something you've never allowed me to do." John let out a long sigh, running his hand through his hair in frustration. He had never imagined that Maria, the woman he had once known, would ever challenge him like this. But here she was, calm and confident, standing her ground. It was something he had never expected, and it rattled him. "This isn't over," he said, though his voice lacked the force it had earlier. "You're right," Maria said, her eyes never leaving his. "This isn't over. But I'm not afraid anymore." The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Maria had spent so much of her life feeling small, powerless, and afraid. But now, standing here in this room, she felt a strength she hadn't known she was capable of. She wasn't afraid of what John might try to do next. She wasn't afraid of the battle ahead. For the first time, Maria felt like she could stand on her own 2 feet, and that feeling, of being in control of her own future, was more powerful than anything John could throw her way. The tension in the room was palpable, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was different. It was a quiet kind of power, a power that Maria now held in her hands. And as John sat there, clearly still processing what had just happened, Maria knew that this was only the beginning. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The moments after Maria's declaration felt like they stretched into eternity. John sat still, his fingers now gripping the edges of the table, the calm, controlled man she had once known now visibly rattled. His usual way of handling situations, pushing, demanding, controlling, had failed him. He had never imagined that Maria, of all people, would take such a bold step. He had always underestimated her, assuming she would always bend to his will. But now, she was standing her ground, and the power shift was undeniable. "You really think this changes everything, don't you?" John's voice was still cold, but there was a tremor in it now, a hint of doubt that hadn't been there before. Maria looked at him, her expression calm but resolute. "I think it changes a lot more than you realize," she said softly. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness. It was simply a statement of fact. For the first time in their relationship, she wasn't afraid to speak her truth, to make her own decisions. And that was the biggest shift of all. John shifted in his seat, clearly trying to regain his composure. He opened his mouth to say something, but paused, his eyes narrowing as he considered his next words carefully. It was clear to Maria that he was recalculating, trying to figure out how to maintain some semblance of control. But she wasn't interested in his calculations anymore. She wasn't interested in his manipulation. "We'll see how this plays out," John said, his words tinged with a sense of finality. But even as he spoke, Maria could tell he wasn't sure. He had always been confident in his ability to get his way, but now that confidence was cracking. Maria didn't let his words faze her. She had made her move, and she was ready for whatever came next. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she was the one in control of her future. She looked around the room, taking in the silent figures of the lawyers who had been mere observers until now. They hadn't spoken much, but Maria could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. She knew that the legal battles weren't over, that there would be more discussions, more negotiations. But in this moment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't fighting for something she didn't believe in. She wasn't trying to appease anyone. She was standing up for herself, for her right to have a say in her own life. John had always treated her like she was powerless, like she had no voice. But now, that voice was loud and clear, and she wasn't going to let him silence it anymore. As she sat there, the weight of the decision she had made began to settle in. She was no longer the woman who would simply accept what was handed to her. She had found her strength, and it felt like a quiet but powerful victory. She wasn't afraid anymore. The room had shifted, the power dynamic had shifted, and as the minutes ticked by, Maria knew she had done the right thing. The battle was far from over, but it no longer felt like she was fighting alone. She had a voice now, and that was all she needed to move forward. John may have thought he still held the reins, but the truth was, Maria was in control now. She had found her own path, and she wasn't turning back. The tension in the room was palpable as Maria sat silently, her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. John, who had been so confident moments before, now looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and uncertainty. His usual bravado had all but disappeared, replaced with a quiet, simmering frustration that was clearly taking hold of him. He had never expected Maria to do this. He had always seen her as someone who would accept his decisions without question, someone who would allow him to control the situation. But now, things were different. Maria had stood her ground, and it had shaken him to his core. She wasn't the woman he thought she was. As the silence stretched on, John's eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming softly on the table. He was deep in thought, calculating his next move. Maria could see the wheels turning in his mind. She could practically hear the inner monologue he was running. How could he regain control? How could he undo what she had done? But Maria wasn't worried. She had already made her move. She had already taken back what was rightfully hers. And nothing John could say or do would take that from her. "You're making a big mistake," John finally said, his voice quieter than before but still carrying an edge of desperation. Maria met his gaze without flinching. "I don't think so," she replied calmly. "I think I'm finally doing what I should have done years ago." There was no anger in her voice, no spite. Just quiet conviction. For the first time, she felt like she was truly in control of her own life, not just reacting to the whims of others, but making choices that would shape her future. The lawyers, who had been watching the exchange with growing interest, now shifted in their seats. Maria could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't mind. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for herself. John shifted in his seat again, but this time it wasn't with the same certainty he had shown earlier. His usual confidence was slipping away, and Maria couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. She had always been the one to second-guess herself, to doubt her decisions, but not anymore. Now, it was John who was doubting. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice a little sharper now. "You've only made things more complicated." Maria shook her head. "No, John. I've simplified things. I'm no longer at your mercy. I'm taking control." The words hung in the air, and Maria could feel the weight of them. It was a statement of truth, a declaration that she wasn't going to let her past dictate her future any longer. John was silent for a moment, his eyes searching hers as if looking for a crack in her resolve. But there was none. Maria's decision was final, and it was clear to both of them that there was no turning back now. The power had shifted, and Maria wasn't going to let it slip away again. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. No longer caught in the web of John's manipulation, no longer a passive participant in her own life. She was moving forward on her terms, and nothing was going to stop her now. As the minutes passed, the room felt smaller, the air thicker with the weight of the unspoken battle. John's frustration was growing, but Maria didn't care. She was done being afraid. She was done being the one to back down. This was her moment, and she was going to take it. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she was ready to face it head-on. No more hiding. No more waiting for permission. This was her life, and she was going to live it on her own terms. The room remained charged with tension as Maria leaned back in her chair, finally feeling the weight of everything that had happened sink in. John, who had been the picture of composure just moments ago, now looked uncharacteristically disoriented. His earlier certainty had been replaced by doubt, and it was clear to Maria that he was trying to figure out his next move. But this time, he wasn't the one calling the shots. "You can't just walk away from this," John muttered, his voice thick with frustration. Maria, however, remained calm. "I'm not walking away from anything, John," she replied. "I'm standing up for myself. Something you never let me do before." There was a quiet finality in her tone, and she could see John's jaw tighten at the words. He had always expected her to cave, to accept the way things had always been. But Maria wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't going to settle for being second to his demands, second to his needs. She wasn't going to let him continue to control her life, to control her choices. His reaction spoke volumes. He couldn't understand why she wasn't backing down. He couldn't understand why she wasn't intimidated by his usual tactics. But Maria had learned over the years, had learned how to live without fear, how to stand her ground. She had done it before, just in smaller ways. But now, in this room, in this moment, she felt the full force of her own strength. John shifted uneasily in his seat, his hands folding and unfolding nervously. Maria could see that he was calculating, trying to determine the next step. But this time, Maria wasn't giving him the chance. She wasn't interested in a drawn-out battle or endless negotiations. She had made her choice, and she wasn't going to waste any more time. "You can make threats all you want," Maria continued, her voice steady, "but I'm not afraid anymore." She could see John's frustration rising, could see the way his eyes darkened with each passing second. But Maria stood firm, unshaken. She wasn't interested in fighting him for the sake of it. She didn't need to be right or to prove a point. What mattered was that she had made a decision for herself. "This isn't about winning or losing," she added, meeting his gaze directly. "It's about taking control of my own life." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Maria felt as though she was being heard. She wasn't just another figure in the background of John's story. She was the author of her own. John let out a long sigh, but his frustration didn't have the same weight as it had earlier. It was the sigh of someone who knew they had lost, even if they refused to admit it. The shift had happened, and it wasn't going to reverse. "You've changed," John muttered, almost to himself. "I guess I have," Maria replied, her voice soft but firm. "And I'm not going back." There was no more fear in her, no more hesitation. She had found something in herself she hadn't realized was there, a strength, a clarity, a purpose. And she was going to move forward with that, no matter what came next. The room had grown quieter, the tension still hanging in the air, but now it felt different. It felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Maria wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt prepared to face it. She wasn't going to let John or anyone else dictate her path. This was her life, and she was going to live it on her own terms. Maria sat back in her chair, her mind finally beginning to calm after the intense moments that had passed. The weight of everything she had done, of every choice she had made up until this point, began to settle inside her. She wasn't just facing John anymore, she was facing herself, her past, and her future. For so long, she had lived in the shadows of other people's decisions, always second-guessing her worth, always giving in. But today, that had changed. She had taken control of her own narrative, and that, in itself, felt like a victory. John, still sitting across from her, didn't speak for a long time. His gaze was fixed on her, but it wasn't the same as before. There was no anger in his eyes, no dominance. Instead, there was something else, something Maria hadn't seen in him for a long time. It was respect, though it was buried beneath layers of disbelief and frustration. He didn't know how to react to this version of Maria, the woman who had finally found her voice. He had spent years believing he could always control the situation, that Maria would always be the one to back down. But now, the tables had turned. Maria was no longer the quiet, compliant ex-wife who just wanted peace. She was standing firm in her own power, and John could feel it. The room seemed to grow quieter, the space between them heavier. John's usual tactics were no longer working. Maria had learned how to navigate the weight of silence, how to turn it into her strength. He shifted again in his seat, clearly trying to regain his footing, but Maria could tell that his confidence was gone. He was no longer the one in control of the situation. Maria had already won. "I don't know what you expect me to say," John said finally, his voice low, but with a hint of resignation. "I expect you to understand that this isn't about me beating you or getting one over on you," Maria replied. "This is about me finally deciding what's best for me. I don't need your approval. I never did." The words hung in the air between them, and John seemed to absorb them slowly. For the first time, Maria could tell that John was actually listening to her, not just hearing her, but truly understanding. It wasn't that he agreed with her, but for the first time in a long while, he saw her as someone who was no longer just a part of his life to control. She was her own person. Maria could feel the shift, the finality in the air. There was no more need to argue, no need to defend her choices. She had made her stand, and she knew she didn't have to justify it to anyone, not even John. She had set boundaries, and she had made her peace. The power had shifted irreversibly in her favor, and there was no turning back. The room was still, save for the quiet sounds of papers shuffling as the lawyers began to prepare for the next steps. Maria didn't even notice them anymore. She wasn't focused on the past, or on what might come next. She was focused on the present moment, on the feeling of freedom that was slowly unfolding inside her. This was her moment of liberation. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes now no longer challenging but thoughtful. "You've changed," he said again, this time with a quiet understanding. "Yes, I have," Maria replied, her voice soft but firm. "And I'm not going back." She knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready for them. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers to navigate. She wasn't waiting for someone else to decide her fate anymore. She had taken control, and no matter what happened next, she knew she had the strength to face it. With that, the room fell into a new kind of silence, one where Maria no longer felt small or uncertain. She had found her voice, and it was powerful. The future was hers to create.